Almost fall, pretty crisp out there this morning. Thank you for allowing me to come this Sunday. David and Dicky have graciously allowed others to join them here delivering Sunday school. My name is Carol Juneau. I currently am teaching pairs and spares, hopefully coming November. We'll see. All numbers in line and all of that. Today we're going to talk about honoring parents. And we know that throughout the Bible, we have examples of honoring parents and those who've gone before us honoring parents. But today, we're going to kind of veer a little from that and we're going to look at a negative example. Not always a plus, but I think when we get through today, you'll find out that the what not to do may be a good reference point for us. When we think about honoring our parents, it's not just I can say I honor my parents, but it's through our words and our actions. So it's not just what we say, but it's what we do. You know, when I think about growing up, clearly I did respect my parents. It was an expectation for me to, yes, sir, no, sir, yes, ma'am, no, ma'am. That was a given. I also knew that when we went to my grandmother's house, which we did quite often for big meals, that the men ate first and the children ate last. I will tell you that when my family comes to our house, that generally we make sure that the kids have their plates. Not always now. And sometimes we just jump in and go for it. But when growing up, it was a little bit different. So our norm today does look different than the norm did when I was growing up. I also knew that if my dad whistled, I better come immediately. It wasn't, wait a minute, I want to do, or no, it was immediate. And if I didn't, if I heard my whole name, then I knew that I was in trouble. So, you know, I think the bottom line was I knew what my parents' expectations were, and I knew that what they were doing and decisions they made were in my best interest. You know, in growing up, my mom died when I was 15, so I didn't have a long time with her, but it was enough because my mom was the spiritual leader in my home. And even by the age of 15, she instilled in me and my siblings a love for God and also the importance of that fellowship in church. We never missed. No matter if the doors were open, we were a part of the fellowship. So, you know, I think that in looking back, that Christian example of my mom especially has lasted some 70 years for me. I knew to respect my parents and grandparents. It was what we did. Society as a whole respected parents, grandparents. So, you know, to say that we are living in a little bit of a different time, yeah, I think so. But that wasn't to say that there weren't times when I was irritated with things my parents did or things my parents said. It wasn't always smooth sailing. But the bottom line was respect was always evident and a part of who we were. You know, I think even thinking today and decisions that were made throughout my growing up years, it was always in the back of my mind, would my mom have been proud of me? Even though she wasn't living, you know, many things that I did or said were prefaced with thinking about her or my dad. My dad wasn't always a great example, but I knew he loved me and I knew he took care of me. Those were things that I knew from that relationship. Family relationships are important, but they can be difficult, as many of you can attest to. But here's what God expects. He expects us to rise above those conflicts. And in spite of everything, God has commanded us to honor our parents and to rise above those conflicts no matter what. You know, as we think about today and where we want to go, we're thinking about, just think about Mount Sinai when Moses was there and the 10 Commandments were delivered. And we know that that was the law of the land. It's still the law of the land today. That's not changed, although we have many who are trying to add their own 2 cents worth and to change the premise of that original law. But we're going to focus on the 5th commandment. And when you think about the 5th commandment, it's sitting right there, almost there in the middle. And we think about the first 4 commandments were around God and our relationship with God. And if we think about the 5th commandment as kind of bridging the commandments 6 through 10, which were about relationships with others, with people to people. So we think about that 5th commandment, and I'm going to just read that 5th commandment. It comes from Exodus 20, and it's verse 12. It says, "Honor your father and your mother, so that you may live long in the land the Lord your God is giving you." Now we know that when this was given, some 450 years prior to David's reign as king of Israel, that the children of Israel, they were always floundering, it seems like. But the children of Israel were a rebellious lot, as some of us are today. They were rebelling. They wanted the quick fix. They wanted to feel good and all. And they would pull back from those 10 commandments that God had given Moses for his children. As they pulled back, we know the history and the story. The Israelites wandered through 40 years in the wilderness. Finally, Joshua led the children of Israel into Canaan, and they were faithful for some time. But when Joshua died, there was a dark period once again, and they pulled to other gods and removed themselves from the God that had given them the 10 Commandments. They cried out because, when we pull back from God, we enter a dark time ourselves, just as the children of Israel did. They cried out, and God sent the judges. And through the reign of the judges, God supported the people through the judges. Near the end of the judges, Hannah gave birth to Samuel. Samuel, one of the last of the judges. And Samuel, who he anointed Saul, but later he anointed David when he was just a young shepherd boy. Had no idea he was to be king. But Samuel, by God's choice, anointed him. So we know that God always keeps a hand on his children. But knowing David and the history of David was a very capable leader for many years. But one thing David was not was maybe the best of parents. Through lots of things that happened in David's life, but he couldn't, there was a lot of intrigue, there was murder, a lot of sexual sins abounded in David's own home. So even though he could keep the people happy, he was not able to manage his own home. And that brings us to where we're going to be talking about in particular, his son Absalom. When we look at the scripture that I just read, the word honor, it begins with the word honor. The word honor in Greek means to hold in highest regard. And I think we would agree with that definition today. If we honor someone, we do hold them in highest regard. It's very weighty and important. God made it clear in this 5th commandment what we were to do. We were to honor and respect parents. Now, how can we show honor and respect? In the commentary today, and I like the way it put it, kind of 3 levels of ways to show honor to our parents. We can do that by emotional honor, which would be investing time in the relationship, spending time with. Even if we don't like everything they do, it's still spending time with. I can tell you, my kids would probably tell you today, they don't like everything that Phil and I do, but, the bottom line, I think there is respect. Verbal honor. This was, I'm thinking of back in my childhood. My mother's name was Ann. I can't even imagine if I'd have said, "Hey, Ann, I don't want to do that," or "I've got other things to do." That would not have happened. But today, as there are times when I hear children pushing back a little bit, and maybe that verbal honor is not as tight as it was before, although there are many. An example this week, and I share this because I had an opportunity to go to the funeral home to just share with someone, and there was a young man there that I thought it was just an example of today's time. This young man, he wanted to speak to the lady that was there, but he didn't want to push in. He was very respectful, and he wore his mask. Now, not many of today's youth see that as something to do, but I looked at that as kind of an honorable thing to do because he didn't have to. It wasn't required, but he did that out of respect. Although it wasn't a parent, it was someone else. And I thought, even today we have many of our youth and others that show respect in some of the little things that they do. That was much appreciated by me and noted. We talk about financial honor. It's not always that when our and I'm elder, okay, I'm right there, but are not always able to care for themselves, maybe don't have the means, or medical responsibilities have just eaten up the resources, whatever. But it's biblical in that when we honor our parents, that we take care of them, the emotional side, the verbal, that conversation, and the financial. That's it in God's law. So I think that it's really important for us to ground ourselves in what God's expectations are for us to make sure that we honor our parents. My parents have been gone many years now, and I don't have that opportunity. But for those that do, certainly to note that. It's a two-way street. We're to honor our parents, but we as parents are to also respect and support, honor, and love our children, and in some cases, grandchildren. I think the Hebrew, we talked about the Greek word honor, meaning to hold in our highest regard. The Hebrew root of the word honor means to be heavy. So I think sometimes heavy is a connotation of being kind of to lift, to be able to hold. I think we have to think about that. Sometimes it's not easy to honor our parents. God never said it would be easy, but it's our responsibility. But it goes back, Jesus had an opportunity to rebuke the Jewish leaders of the day. Sometimes I think they made some foolish decisions, but not so unlike where we are today. I think sometimes we're making some foolish decisions. But he rebuked these Jewish leaders because their thought was, oh, well, in the monetary end, I have put all my resources aside. I'm going to give it to the Lord. I'm giving it to God. So there's nothing left to take care of the parents. Their responsibility was to honor their parents, and by honoring their parents, it was for them to care for their parents, but they refused to help their parents. But yet they told Jesus it was because they're giving it all to the Lord, you know. So sometimes we make those excuses, just like those Jewish leaders. Oh, well, I'll give a little bit, but you know, it's okay. I don't have anything left over. You know, I know that no parent's perfect. No one, not one. We failed sometimes in maybe doing what our children think we should do. But we also know that in many cases around this world that some parents have even they've failed as parents. They've maybe even been abusive. No matter though, God calls us to treat our parents with honor. That's a tough place to be there. Now, it doesn't require us to stay in a relationship that's abusive or not healthy for children, but it still means to remove ourselves from that situation, but be forgiving in our hearts. And that's really, really tough. When we feel wronged, we want to many times seek revenge. I say that because that kind of is where our lesson's going today. That unforgiving heart can sometimes lead to building animosity and anger and resentment. When I think about today, this world we live in, you know, when I was young, respecting our parents, that was easy. Everybody did. It was not anything out of the norm. In today's world, we live in a society that doesn't always honor parents. It doesn't honor authority. The When that happens, the foundation of our society is broken. That broken fellowship. When we think about in this world today, that creates chaos. It creates division that will ultimately destroy society. We want to protect our society. We go back to the law of the land, that 10 Commandments. If we adhere to that law, then chaos cannot become a part of who we are. Division would not be a part of our society. I think when we look at society today, we have a lot of division. Politically, oh my goodness, here we are in election year and we're just inundated with all of this political unrest, and it's just not a good place to be. I personally just usually turn it off. If I don't have to listen to it, I feel better. We have protesting over everything, anything and everything. Everyone feels entitled to say whatever they want to say and do whatever they want to do. Hence, this breakdown in our society. Obedience to all of God's commands was expected then, when Moses and the Israelites were here, and now. And I think sometimes we have kind of forgotten that. We're going to move on into part of today's lessons, which takes us to 2 Samuel. Now, when we look at 2 Samuel, let's look a little bit about what was going on prior to picking up in this scripture. We have to understand, we know that David's story was kind of a tragic story, and especially when it concerned his children. His son, Absalom, was, I would call it a what not to do story, for sure. Absalom was the third son of David. He came from his fourth wife, Micah. I'm not sure if I'm saying these names right, just roll with me. Micah of Geshur. Now, marriage in David's time and in the early biblical history, many times marriage, especially for a king, was not about love, not really, probably about respect. It was more for political gain. So it was about acquiring allegiances or possibly land, but definitely the thought of love, honor, and respect were maybe not a part of that. I'm not saying whether it was or wasn't, but maybe not. Most of David's marriages, you could almost call it alliances, were for political domination or related in that way. And because of that, probably caused some jealousy and strife among not only the wives, but the siblings. Kind of jockeying for position, I'm first, you're second, that kind of stuff, which does not bode well for relationships. So I think when we think about where Absalom was placed there, being he wasn't the first son, wasn't even the second, he was the third. His mother, he probably knew was not loved or valued other than politically. So for all of that, that undermines relationships. Not sure, if the siblings were even close or if they interacted. We don't know that. But Absalom made a choice. Absalom did not honor David in any way. Honoring our parents means that we are acting with truthfulness and integrity. In no way can we say that Absalom did that. He chose not to honor his father, therefore a negative. So when I referenced in the beginning that this was more or less a negative example of the fifth commandment, then you'll get where we're going. History for Absalom, to kind of help us understand, Absalom had a sister, Tamar, a full sister. They were full siblings. But another half sibling, Amnon, who was Absalom's half brother, raped his half sister Tamar. Now, this was Absalom's sister, and he was angered. This just destroyed his feelings for Amnon that he would do that. But it also put hatred in Absalom's heart. Hatred for his brother, half-brother, and the beginnings of hatred for his father. Absalom harbored this hatred for 2 years. He must have been a real planner because he planned to annihilate Amnon. There was a big festival that he instigated, and during that festival, Absalom had Amnon killed. So he destroyed his brother for what he did. Because of that, Absalom fled to Geshur. Now, knowing that Geshur was one of the things I found in the commentary is that Maacah, who was Absalom's mother, was from Geshur, and her father was King Talmai. And we know that she came to David's court from Geshur. So where did Absalom go for exile? Back to Geshur, who was ruled by his grandfather, just so you kind of get a picture of what's going on. He stayed there for 3 years. David eventually allowed Absalom to return to Jerusalem. Now, Geshur was not far. We're talking, I'm not sure, 19, 20 miles, something like that away. But he was allowed to return. Now, for 3 years, there had been no contact between David and Absalom. And David did allow Absalom to come back, but he didn't see him for 2 more years. Can you imagine not seeing your child for 2 more years? No matter what they've done. But that was 5 years. The 3 he was in exile and the 2 that he was back in Jerusalem, that David had not seen Absalom. You can imagine that in that heart that was eat up with revenge, with hate, that it probably just festered and kept growing. Can't even imagine what his heart felt, Absalom's heart felt like. That revenge and hatred was just, that animosity was building all this time. Little did David even realize what was going on with Absalom. He was planning an act. I mean, he put a lot of thought into planning his revenge on David. He was mounting a whole campaign to take over the kingship. Now, Absalom, here's a side note. He was the oldest son now. Being the oldest son, the kingship would have been his if he had waited for his time, but he wasn't willing to wait. There was no willingness on his part to just sit back and let David rule until his time was over, or until what time David chose to hand over the kingdom. No way. He was out for revenge in any way he could. Absalom began a campaign to undermine David's kingship and his throne. Absalom, to David's face, played nice, I would call it. He said the right things, he looked the right way, so that David would not see beyond that surface what Absalom was harboring in his heart. So what Absalom did, he asked David, he said, I made a promise that I would go to Hebron, which is about 19 miles from Jerusalem, to worship. And he was just saying all the right words, because in David's eyes, that meant that he was ready to turn over a new leaf, that he was giving his life to God, that he was trying to do the right thing. David's last 3 words to Absalom in his entire life were, "Go in peace." It's the last 3 words he ever said to his son. Now, the plan Absalom was laying together was pretty convoluted, but it also involved a lot of people. So a lot of planning was taking place. This is not something that Absalom hatched overnight. This was something he worked toward, planned toward, and had a complete campaign lined out. Here was basically kind of a synopsis of the plan. Let's read that scripture, and then we'll talk a little further about it. This first scripture comes from 2 Samuel 15, 7 through 12. It says, at the end of 4 years, now remember, this is when he came to his father. It says, at the end of 4 years, Absalom said to the king, "Let me go to Hebron and fulfill a vow I made to the Lord. While your servant was living in Geshur in Aram, I made this vow. If the Lord takes me back to Jerusalem, I will worship the Lord in Hebron." The king, meaning David, the king said to him, "Go." So he went to Hebron. Then Absalom sent secret messengers throughout the tribes of Israel to say, "As soon as you hear the sound of the trumpets, then say, 'Absalom is king in Hebron.'" 200 men from Jerusalem had accompanied Absalom. They had been invited as guests and went quite innocently, knowing nothing about the matter, the plan. While Absalom was offering sacrifices, he also sent for Ahithophel the Gilonite, David's counselor, to come from Gila, I'm not sure, his hometown. And so the conspiracy gained strength, and Absalom's following kept on increasing. Here's the thing. Absalom plotted, but he involved many people in what was going on. And he undermined David, the king's whole following. But he did it very cunningly. First of all, he invited those 200 men, and they didn't even know what was going on. They were invited guests. Oh, yeah, we'll go to Hebron. Absalom's trying to do the right thing. Once they got there, though, they were captive. Know that Hebron, from what I read, was had a walled city. So they were pretty much in a fortress and protected. Here's the thing. They didn't know what the plan was. They didn't know what Absalom was plotting against David. But when he invited these men, probably they might have been officials in David's court. We don't know. But maybe higher placed citizens of that day. What that did was weaken David's staff. He didn't have those 200 men that he had counted on before. And these men knew nothing about what Absalom was planning to do. So they were caught up in this, unbeknownst to them. But while that was all going on, Absalom also was offering sacrifices, which noted here in the commentary that many times when those higher up or in line for a kingdom were offering sacrifices, it meant that things were in place and they were probably ready to step up as the next king. So he was doing all the right things to make it look good and look like he was the one. So the plot thickens as we go on. So he continued to do that. That was another kind of a nail in the coffin for David that kind of set things in place. The conspiracy grew stronger here because David sent for, and I'm not sure how to say it, but Ahithophel. He was David's counselor. Now that was a little higher up, a little closer to David the king. He was an advisor to the king. But here's the thing. Ahithophel certainly wasn't totally in David's good grace. I'm not sure about that. But the thing that stands out to me is the fact that he jumped ship very quickly. When Absalom asked him to come to him in Hebron, he did. Now, just a note, and it's kind of fuzzy here as to who Ahithophel was, but some seem to think that because of later references to Eliam being Ahithophel's son, and Eliam being Bathsheba's father, that it could possibly be that Ahithophel was Bathsheba's grandfather. And we know that story and the things that happened there and Uriah's death and all of those. So that could be that Ahithophel had a hidden agenda. We don't know. But just to know that very quickly he jumped ship and he became one of Absalom's advisors there. And it's just as though this plot kept thickening, people on board with where Absalom was going, but no one knew what his plan was. So that conspiracy was gaining strength this whole time. When we look at that, Absalom continued, I would say, to win friends and influence people, because that's what he was doing, and he was good at it. He knew what to say and who to say it to and who to bring in to his allegiance, kind of like joining the bandwagon. We see a lot of that today. So I think we just need to know that Absalom displayed duplicity rather than integrity. That was one statement that I thought just really said it all. He was very cunning, conniving, and working behind the scenes to undermine everything that Israel stood for. And his was all related to revenge, extracting that revenge, and it was about his own personal revenge, and he didn't care who was caught up in the midst and the mess of it. David, by no means, was a perfect father. As we know with all of his children, with his relationships with wives, with the whole 9 yards. We know. And we know that David could have possibly repaired some of those relationships. We don't know. But we have to know that both children and parents reap negative consequences when we dishonor God's commandments. When we dishonor that fifth commandment, then we know that there's possibly a negative consequences to that. Both parents and children must act with truth and integrity, which we know that Absalom did not. And if we're to ever amend broken relationships, both have to work at it before it escalates into something uncontrollable. We know that in the case of David and Absalom, David didn't even speak to him for 5 years. Was there an opportunity for him to reach out and to mend that broken relationship? We don't know. But, we can replay that for us today. If there's an opportunity for us to mend a broken relationship, it's God's will that we do so. So I think that's one piece of, if you want to say, advice that we could take from this negative story. We move on into the last part of the scripture. It's 2 Samuel 15, but we're going to read verses 13 and 14. It says, "A messenger came and told David, 'The hearts of the people of Israel are with Absalom.' Then David said to all his officials who were with him in Jerusalem, 'Come, we must flee, or none of us will escape from Absalom. We must leave immediately, or he will move quickly to overtake us and bring ruin on us and put the city to the sword.'" David knew that he had reached a turning point. But I think it's really significant here that David was one of the last to hear of all the stuff that Absalom had been planning. I mean, Absalom had mounted this campaign where those 200 men were to infiltrate the area. They were to, what they were doing was to, at the point that the signal was given, they were to shout out, as we saw in the last scripture, Absalom is king in Hebron. And we know that communication in that day and time was slow at best, word of mouth. And we know, even playing that little game where you repeat something and keep repeating it, how messages are convoluted and how they are changed by the time you get to the end of it. Who knows? Who knows? But the message was loud and clear. Absalom wanted to be king, and he was doing whatever he could to make that happen. So I think for us, just to know that Absalom definitely, he was pretty smart. If he had all of that in place and things were moving in the direction he wanted, then we know he was a pretty smart kind of guy. But David was the last to hear of everything going on. But he also was smart enough to know that he was going to have to get out of there. If he didn't, it was going to cause lots of people to lose their lives in Jerusalem, and that was not what he wanted. Verse 14 kind of leads us to believe that Absalom's forces probably had pretty great military strength, because David knew, however, I don't know, but he probably understood that they were going to have to get out because they were not equipped to fight Absalom at that point. So David and his followers journeyed beyond the Jordan River, and there they organized and got themselves ready for battle. When you think about what transpired at that point, David readied his troops. He knew that he couldn't do it as he was, so he knew he had to be ready. One of the things that David asked his troops was, in the battle, please be gentle with Absalom. Even though all that had happened, he was still his son, and he asked for them to be gentle with him. Now, in 2 Samuel 18:5, it goes on, and that's not in today's scripture, but it goes on to tell us that both forces met in battle in the forest of Ephraim. And David was able to use the terrain around him to actually to enforce his battle and to make it victorious. He actually killed 20,000 of the Absalom's forces, so he was victorious. But during the battle, Absalom rode a donkey, and somehow, I don't know how, his head got stuck in an oak tree. And even though David had asked his commanders to be gentle, they knew that they killed Absalom, his commander Joab, and some other followers. So when David, after the battle, asked about his son, they informed him that he was dead. And David was distraught. He mourned, he wept, he was just almost inconsolable. You know, it says, he said, "Oh, my son Absalom, my son, my son." He went on and on about that. But Joab knew, very smart man there, he knew that there was a lot of danger here. If David was going on and on about this traitor, even though he was his son, who was to undermine his kingdom and would have killed him had he had the chance, Joab knew that this was kind of like a slap in the face to the people who had followed David. So he brought David up and told him, he said, "No, you can't go on like this. You're going to have to value the ones who followed you, who fought for you, and not this traitorous son you're going on about." So Joab rebuked David and told him quite plainly, "You need to go out there and you need to speak to your people and you need to tell them that, even though his heart was broken, that David valued what his people had done. And most likely, because he followed the advice of this commander Joab, it probably saved David's kingdom or his kingship at that time. I think for us today is to say that sometimes siding with popular majority is not always a good decision. And sometimes fleeing conflict rather than fighting is being smart. It's not always stand your ground and fight. That's not always the right advice. Honoring one's parents includes acting in their best interest with integrity and truthfulness. Two words that keep coming over and over: integrity and truthfulness. And I think for us, kind of in closing, I really, thought about this lesson in terms of today and in David's day. There's a lot of analogies we can make there. Whatever it means, Absalom demonstrated rebellion. He had a rebellious heart. He was revengeful. He did not value his parent. For us, advice today, I would say, is that we, all of us, we must be a model of truthfulness and integrity in front of people. Those people might be your children, it might be your grandchildren, it might be the children of others, but that's our responsibility. Our lives should be an example for others. I hope this week that you will think about that in decisions and things that you do, and I hope you have a blessed day and just enjoy this beautiful sunshine and all that we have. Thank you for being here this morning.